So what's the fundamental myth underlying the modern corporation?
So when you give this argument about the invalidity of the employment contract and abolishing rentals, then one argument you'll get back, almost guarantee, is, well, the employer owns the firm, and he has ownership right to all the future products, and owns the management rights and so forth. It's all part of his private property when he owns the firm. And so what we are suggesting they see as abolishing that private property right. And this, I used to, when I first started thinking about these issues, I was also caught up in this idea that somehow the rights to manage and the rights to the product are part of what you own when you own capital. And this used to, in the old days, this used to be also what was considered part of ownership of land, that the person who owned the land automatically had the right to govern, in the political sense, govern whoever lived on the land. And so what today we call the landlord was, in historical terms, the lord of the land. He ran the courts, he ran the political system, and so forth. So owning land was seen as carrying with it all these governance rights over the people. And then that idea people carry over metaphorically to capital. Said, well, if I own the machine, then I sort of own the enterprise where the machine is used with labor and so forth. And that turns out simply to be false. And it's very easy to see that it's false in the current system, because you can rent a machine. You see, so when I rent a machine from somebody else and I use it in a business, he still owns the machine, but he doesn't have management power in that business. He has the right not to rent it to me. If he doesn't like the rental, he can negotiate the rental. But he doesn't. When I use the machine in the business, he doesn't have any management right at all. So when I rent a car, the rental car company can say, well, you can't drive here, you can't drive above this speed, or they can put constraints on it, but they can't tell me where to drive, or they don't have the discretionary control that we would associate with managing the use of this machine. So when the rental contract goes the way in which the machine is the one that's rented, not the person is rented using the machine, then they still own the machine, but they don't have those. So those rights are actually not part of the ownership of the machine. They're not part of the ownership of capital. And so the rights in the conventional firm to manage and to own the product are a result of the contracts that are made. So what in economic terms we call a contractual position, not an ownership position. So if I have, in the system as it exists now, if I rent all and buy all the inputs, and thus rent the machines and already own the machines, or buy the secondary goods that are inputs, or buy the energy and whatever. So I've owned all what economists call the inputs into the process, including the labor. Then I bear all those costs, and then I get the claim on the product. And so it's not that the claim on the product was part of the ownership of the capital, because the building might be rented, the land might be rented, the machinery might be rented. But I was the one that paid all those costs of the rentals, if I didn't already own them, and I got the product anyway. So getting the product is not a function of owning the capital. It's a function of being the last person that pays all the cost involved in that, the rental cost of the capital, or the rental cost of the land, or whatever it is, which is independent of whether I actually own the land or own the machine or the buildings. Now, when you take that machine and that land and that building and you put it in a corporation, you see, then you simply have an indirect way to own those assets. And yes, you do have owners of the corporation, but the corporation need not be the legal party undertaking the production process. Corporations lease out their buildings and lease out their land, and lease out their capital, their machinery. And it's the fact that the corporation typically hires in labor and buys the other inputs that it then gets to own the product. So the ownership that the shareholder has of the corporation isn't the ownership of the firm in the sense of the economic entity undertaking the business. It's just ownership of an asset holding bin that could be used to do business if you make the right rental contracts, or could just be used to rent it out. When I have a corporation that's in real estate business, that I rent out real estate, lease out, shopping space or something to a company. I don't run that company. I'm just one of the suppliers. Yet I own the building, you see, or I own the mall, or whatever it is. So owning that corporation that then owns the mall doesn't mean I owned all those businesses, because I lease the space to these other businesses that run in that mall. So the myth is the myth that owning the capital, the means of production, means you are automatically the employer isn't true. Capital can be rented, land can be rented, machines can be rented, and buildings can be rented, and so forth. So it's not just human beings that can be rented in the system. And it's really this question of who ends up renting who. So what we're suggesting is not that this false property right be taken away, because the property right doesn't exist. What exists is the right to rent human beings in addition to the right to rent all these other things, and that's what allows the existing corporation to become the firm, undertake the business, by renting all the people or employing all the people that actually work in the corporation. And so it's that role, it's the contractual role that counts, not the shareholders' right to own the corporation, because even when the corporation is just an asset holding bin leasing out, then the shareholders have exactly the same rights they had before. It's just now that their business is one of leasing out capital rather than employing capital together with labor to produce a product. So that's what is the fundamental myth, this idea that somehow it's part and parcel of private property rights that I am the manager and I am the employer and I get the product as part of that. So what we are suggesting is not that property right be abolished, because that property right doesn't exist, that the right to manage. That depends on how the contracts are written. And the way in which the employer gets the legal right to govern the workers is not because he owns the factory building or owns some capital, but because he's employed them. And the building may be rented too, and the land may be rented too. And it's the rental contracts over the people and over the buildings that gives them the management rights over the enterprise. So one has to be very clear about. So what are we really saying? So we're not denying any existing private property right of the employers. We're denying them the contractual opportunity to rent other human beings. That's what we're doing. And that's already been denied them in the abolition of the slavery contract, when involuntary slavery was abolished, also voluntary slavery was abolished. So that violates their freedom of contract. The freedom to buy other people has already been abolished. The freedom to have a marriage contract where the woman becomes a sub-person, that's been abolished. And we're also saying if society is going to continue to improve, that you also have to abolish this freedom to contract to rent other people. That people should always be the members in whatever enterprise they do as equal members of these democratic enterprises. And so there's no abolition of private property. In fact, you're improving private property. You're abolishing the myth that they have these rights as part of their private property. And you're denying them the contractual freedom to rent other people, just as they're already denied the contractual freedom to own other people or to marry and make the partner be a sub-person. And of course, also this political contract, they're denied the right to make themselves a king by getting people to give up their right to govern themselves to them in a non-democratic constitution. So there are all sorts of contracts that are already abolished in the great abolitions of the past, and the abolition of slavery and the abolition of the old form of marriage and the abolition of monarchies in favor of political democracy. And we're suggesting that society should continue to improve by abolishing this whole notion that you can rent yourself out and become an employee in an enterprise rather than an equal member that democratically elects the board of directors or the legislature that then chooses the management. So that's the fundamental myth, and that's how it plays into these arguments that you have to get people to think beyond and say, this can't be part of the ownership of capital, because capital can be rented and then you still own the capital, but you're not managing the thing and you're not managing the business. And so the manager of the business couldn't have been part of the capital, right? Because you still own the capital. And so it's really how the rental contract is made. So we are suggesting that society should continue to be improved, and the contractual freedom, the liberty of contract to sell yourself, the liberty of contract to get married as a sub-person, and the liberty of contract to rent yourself out are all fraudulent liberties that people don't actually become sub-persons real, or don't actually become things, and don't actually become rented things in the employment contract. It's just an institutionalized fraud, and all those contracts, not just the other ones, should be abolished. And so that just as you can't give up these rights in the old form of these contracts, so in a really just society, you would not be able to rent yourself out. You would become a member in every place in which you work, and a member, which is like a work for cooperative, where you become a member of the cooperative and work in it for a certain time period. And